The air in the Lexington, Kentucky Community Center crackled with a nervous energy, a low hum of anticipation. It wasn't a fancy place, just a plain, multi-purpose hall with white walls and a slightly faded wooden stage. But tonight, it held something precious, a chance for connection. Folding chairs were packed tight, row upon row, filled with neighbors, families, and curious minds, all eager to glimpse the man they'd only seen on TV, the now retired president. A few kids fidgeted, restless energy bubbling beneath the surface, and an elderly couple in the back whispered, their hands intertwined, a silent testament to years of shared life. This wasn't a media circus, no flashing cameras or probing journalists. This was a town hall, raw, personal, unfiltered, the kind of place where people came seeking not spectacle, but answers. The former president sat on the stage, a relaxed demeanor belying the weight of the years he'd carried in office. Dressed in a navy blazer and an open-collared shirt, he seemed lighter, somehow. But the lines etched around his eyes hinted at the stories he held, the burdens he'd borne. The evening had been, so far, almost predictably routine. Questions about local issues, national policies, the ever-present state of the economy. His answers were thoughtful, careful, the practiced responses of a seasoned politician. The audience clapped politely, but the energy in the room felt subdued, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something more. And then it happened. From the middle of the crowd, a small hand shot up. At first, no one noticed. The president scanned the room, nodding towards a man who had begun to rise, ready to pose his question. But before the man could speak, a voice, a soft, high-pitched voice that didn't belong to any adult, cut through the murmur. "Excuse me, Mr. President." Heads turned. The low hum of conversation died instantly. There, standing barely tall enough to reach the microphone, was a boy, no older than 10. His round glasses slid down his nose as he clutched a small index card in one hand, his other hand nervously tugging at the hem of his sweater. The president smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and motioned for the boy to come forward. "Go ahead, son," he said, his voice kind and inviting. The boy hesitated, his sneakers scuffing against the worn wooden floor as he approached the microphone stand. His mother sat a few rows back, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were white, her face a mixture of pride and apprehension. He took a deep breath, lifting the index card to his face, then lowering it again. I have a question," he said, his voice trembling but audible. He swallowed hard. What does God mean to you? The air in the room shifted. It was as if a silent shockwave had passed through the audience. All conversation ceased. Even the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background. It was the kind of question that caught everyone off guard, including the president. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His expression softened, his gaze fixed on the boy, as if he were seeing something far beyond a curious child. The room felt heavier, charged with an energy no one had anticipated. That's a big question," he finally said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But it's an important one. Let me tell you what God means to me." He paused, and everyone in the room leaned in, knowing instinctively that they were about to hear something unforgettable. Answers to questions like these, he knew, didn't come from a script. They came from the deepest parts of who we are. The boy's question seemed to ripple outwards, silencing even the faintest whispers. It wasn't the type of inquiry anyone had prepared for. People had expected talk of policies, national debates, perhaps even light-hearted anecdotes from the president's time in office. But this was different. Raw, personal, deeply human. The president sat back in his chair, the creak of the old wood barely audible in the stillness. His hands, which had gestured with ease during earlier questions, now rested on his lap, fingers intertwined. He took a moment, absorbing the weight of what had been asked. He looked out over the room, scanning the faces, faces that now mirrored a kaleidoscope of emotions: curiosity, anticipation, even a flicker of discomfort. The boy's mother, seated near the middle, leaned forward, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but she stopped herself. Her hands remained clasped, her knuckles bone-white. She hadn't expected him to actually ask his question, not in front of all these people. But there he was, standing tall, despite the nervous tremor in his hands. An older woman in the front row adjusted her scarf, leaning towards her husband to whisper, "Did you hear that?" He nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the small figure at the microphone. A teenage girl near the back pulled out her phone, not to scroll, but to record. This wasn't something you saw every day. The boy's small frame seemed even smaller under the bright fluorescent lights overhead. The microphone stand had been hastily lowered by a volunteer, but it was still a little too high. He tilted his head up, his round glasses catching the glare, and pushed them up his nose with a shaky finger. The president finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He studied the boy for a moment, his expression soft but unreadable. For a man who had faced world leaders, navigated international crises, and weathered countless interviews, this moment seemed to carry a unique, profound weight. "You asked what God means to me," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "That's a big question. Maybe the biggest one there is." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't the polished, practiced smile people were used to seeing. This one was genuine, almost wistful. The boy didn't move. His small hands gripped the edges of the podium for support. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the president, as though trying to absorb every single word. The silence in the room was palpable. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was expectant, like the quiet before the first note of a symphony. The audience leaned forward in their seats, drawn into the gravity of the moment. The president exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as he prepared to speak. "You know, when I was about your age, I had questions like that too," he began, his voice steady, but tinged with something deeper, nostalgia perhaps. But stories like this don't just answer questions. They pull you into a journey, one that makes you see the world a little differently. And the audience, every single person, was ready to listen. The boy's hands tightened around the edges of the microphone stand, his knuckles pale against his small, trembling fingers. His round glasses slipped down his nose again, and this time, he didn't push them up. Instead, he kept his eyes on the man before him, searching his face for some sign of understanding. The president shifted in his chair, leaning forward as though to close the distance between them. "That's a big question," he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "What does God mean to me?" The audience seemed frozen in time, each person caught in their own thoughts as they waited for him to continue. An older man in the back crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face unreadable, but his eyes locked on the stage. A young woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue, as if the weight of the question alone had struck something deep within her. The president let the silence linger for a moment longer, as though gathering the strength to delve into a part of himself he didn't often share. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "I think, to answer that, I need to tell you a story," he began, his gaze softening as it rested on the boy. "When I was your age, I didn't think much about God. My family wasn't very religious. We'd go to church on Easter or Christmas, but it wasn't something we talked about at home. Faith was something I thought belonged to other people, not to me." The boy tilted his head slightly, his expression curious, but hesitant, as if unsure what to make of the president's admission. "But then, something happened that changed the way I saw the world," the president continued. "I was about 12 years old when I lost someone very important to me. My grandmother." His voice caught slightly on the last word, and he paused to clear his throat. "She was "The rock of our family," he said, his eyes briefly glancing towards the ceiling, as if searching for her presence. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my teacher, my guide, my safe place. When she passed, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I didn't know what to believe in anymore. I didn't even know how to grieve. The boy's mother, seated a few rows back, inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Her son had asked the question, but it was clear she was hearing something she, too, needed to hear. "I remember sitting in her house after the funeral," the president continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were reliving the memory. "I found her old Bible on the coffee table. It was worn, the pages yellowed from years of use. She had scribbled notes in the margins, thoughts, prayers, little reminders to herself. I didn't know why, but I started flipping through it, looking for something. I didn't even know what I was looking for." He paused, letting the memory settle in the room. The boy didn't move, his eyes wide, hanging on every word. "And then, I found it," the president said, his voice breaking slightly. Next to a verse about faith, she had written, "God is love, even when life isn't." A soft gasp escaped from someone in the audience. It wasn't just the words. It was the rawness of the moment that pierced through the stillness. "I didn't understand it at first," he admitted, his gaze now distant, as though speaking to the memory itself. "How could love exist in a world where someone like her could be taken away? How could I believe in a God who let that happen? But over time, I started to see what she meant," he continued. "She wasn't saying life would always be fair, or easy, or even kind. She was saying that love is what holds us together when life falls apart." The boy blinked rapidly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. The audience was equally spellbound, their collective breath almost audible, as they waited for what would come next. The president straightened slightly in his chair, his tone growing firmer. "From that moment on, I stopped looking for God in the sky, or in some perfect version of life. I started looking for God in the love people show each other, in the courage to keep going, in the kindness of strangers, in the little things we do for one another that remind us we're not alone." The boy's lips trembled, and for a moment it looked as though he might cry. But he didn't. He simply nodded, the smallest of gestures, yet one that carried the weight of his understanding. The president smiled faintly, leaning forward again. Does that make sense to you?" The boy hesitated, before nodding again, this time more confidently. His hands relaxed their grip on the microphone stand. "But questions like his don't just seek answers. They open doors to the parts of ourselves we often keep hidden. And in that room, every person felt a piece of their own heart laid bare." The president's voice grew steadier as he continued, though his words carried the weight of someone revisiting deeply personal memories. The room seemed to lean in collectively, each person hanging on his every word. "For a long time," he said, looking directly at the boy, "I thought faith was about having all the answers. I thought people who believed in God somehow knew something the rest of us didn't. But I've come to realize that faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust. Trusting in the love we give and receive, even when life feels impossible." The boy tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowed in thought. The president offered a gentle smile. "Let me tell you another story," he said, glancing briefly at the audience before returning his gaze to the boy. "A few years ago, I met a woman in Michigan. She was a single mother, raising 2 kids on her own. She'd been through more than most of us can imagine. She'd lost her husband in a car accident, lost her job shortly after, and was barely making ends meet. Yet, every night, she'd sit with her kids and pray, not for miracles, not for money, but for strength. Just enough strength to get through one more day." The boy's eyes widened slightly. His lips parted as he listened. Around the room, heads nodded subtly. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of so many who had faced life's hardships with nothing but grit and faith to carry them forward. "I asked her once," the president continued, "how she kept going, how she managed to hold her family together when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. And do you know what she told me? He paused, looking directly at the boy again. Faith, she said, isn't waiting for someone to save you. It's knowing you have the strength to save yourself, and believing that God gave you that strength for a reason. The room seemed to collectively inhale, the weight of her words settling like a blanket over the audience. The president's voice softened. That mother taught me more about faith than I ever learned in any church. She showed me that faith isn't about expecting life to be easy. It's about finding the courage to do hard things, to love deeply, and to keep going, even when it feels like the world is against you. He shifted in his seat, his expression growing more introspective. I think a lot of us spend our lives searching for something, some sign, some proof that God is real. But what I've learned is that God isn't something you find. God is something you feel. It's in the way we show kindness to a stranger, the way we forgive someone who hurt us, the way we stand by the people we love, even when it's hard. That's where I see God, in love, in action, in the things we do every day that remind us we're not alone in this world. The boy's small hands gripped the edge of the podium again, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. His eyes were fixed on the president, his expression a mix of wonder and understanding. I'll be honest with you, the president continued, his voice dropping slightly. There have been times in my life when I've doubted, when I've looked at the pain and suffering in the world and wondered if God was even there. But every time I felt that doubt, I've been reminded of the love people are capable of. Love isn't always big or flashy. Sometimes it's as small as a smile or a helping hand. But it's real. And for me, that's enough proof of God. The audience was silent, save for the occasional sniffle or the rustling of someone shifting in their seat. Even those who hadn't come for anything more than curiosity now found themselves caught up in the depth of his words. The president leaned forward, his eyes locking on the boys once again. You're brave for asking that question, he said, his voice steady and warm. It takes courage to talk about faith, to ask about it, and to think about what it really means. And I hope you never lose that courage, because the world needs people like you, people who aren't afraid to ask the big questions and look for love and truth in everything they do. The boy's lip quivered, and for a moment, he looked as though he might cry. But instead, he smiled, a shy, grateful smile that seemed to light up his whole face. The president returned the smile, then turned to address the audience. I think we all owe this young man a thank you, he said, because tonight, he reminded us of something we often forget. Faith isn't just about answers. It's about asking questions, even the hard ones. And it's about love. The kind of love that carries us through no matter what life throws our way. The audience broke into applause, not the polite kind that had punctuated earlier questions, but something more profound. People stood, some wiping tears from their cheeks, others simply looking around as if trying to hold on to the moment for just a little longer. But the answer wasn't just for the boy. It was for everyone in that room. It was a reminder of what they all carried inside, even if they hadn't realized it until now. The applause lingered, not out of obligation, but because no one seemed ready to let go of the moment. It was as if the boy's question had cracked something open, not just for the president, but for everyone in the room. When the clapping finally subsided, a man in his late 60s stood up. His voice carried the gravel of a life lived hard, but his words were steady. Mr. President, he began, I lost my son last year. He was only 34. Since then, I have been so angry. At God, at the world, at everyone, but hearing what you just said, he paused, swallowing hard as his voice cracked. Hearing what you said about love, about finding God and the strength to keep going, it's the first time I've felt like maybe I can heal. The room grew impossibly quiet again, the weight of his pain shared by everyone listening. The president nodded, his expression one of deep empathy. I am so sorry for your loss, he said softly. It takes incredible courage to share something like that. And thank you Thank you for reminding us how powerful love can be, even in the face of loss. From across the room, a younger woman raised her hand, her face streaked with tears. She looked to be in her early 30s, clutching the hand of the man seated beside her. I I grew up in a really strict religious home, she said, her voice trembling. We were told to fear God, to always do exactly as we were told, or we'd be punished. I walked away from it all as soon as I could, but that left me feeling empty, like I didn't belong anywhere. She paused, looking down at her lap before continuing. What you said about finding God in love, in the everyday moments, I've never thought about it that way. Maybe faith doesn't have to be about fear. Maybe it can be about hope instead. The president offered her a gentle smile. Faith can be many things, he said, but at its best, I believe it's about connection, to ourselves, to each other, and to something bigger than all of us. And hope is what keeps us moving forward, even when it feels like we're walking in the dark. Several people murmured in agreement. The room had transformed into something far beyond a simple town hall meeting. It had become a shared experience, a moment of collective reflection that no one could have anticipated. The boy's mother finally spoke up from her seat, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I want to thank you for answering my son's question, she said, her words directed at the president, but spoken loud enough for the whole room to hear. He's been asking about God for months now, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. What you said tonight, I think it's exactly what he needed to hear. Her son looked up at her, his face softening at her words. He whispered something inaudible, and she smiled, pulling him close for a moment before letting him return his attention to the stage. The president's gaze softened as he addressed her. You've raised a remarkable young man, he said. Questions like his don't come from nowhere. They come from a place of curiosity, courage, and love. That says a lot about you as a parent. The boy's small smile grew just a bit wider, and the pride in his mother's face was unmistakable. Across the room, the ripple effect of the moment continued. Strangers began to exchange quiet words, sharing stories that might otherwise have remained unspoken. An elderly woman with a cane leaned over to the young couple beside her, recounting how her faith had carried her through the loss of her husband decades earlier. A man in his 40s, still wearing his work uniform, wiped at his face as he whispered something to the woman seated next to him. And in the center of it all, the boy sat quietly, his small shoulders now relaxed, as though a great weight had been lifted. The president stepped down from the stage, making his way through the crowd. He paused to shake hands, exchange a few words, and offer comforting smiles to those who stopped him. When he reached the boy, he crouched slightly to meet him at eye level. You're going to do great things one day, he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Keep asking those big questions. They're what make the world a better place. The boy's face lit up, his shy smile returning as he whispered a quiet, "Thank you." But moments like this don't just end. They echo in the hearts of everyone who witnesses them, reminding them of the questions they've asked and the answers they still seek. As the evening came to a close, the energy in the room felt different, lighter, warmer, yet somehow still electric. The conversations that had begun as whispers now filled the space with gentle hums of connection. People weren't just leaving, they were lingering, drawn together by the shared vulnerability of what they had just experienced. The president returned to the stage, his steps deliberate and measured. He surveyed the room with a look of quiet appreciation, as though he understood that this night had turned into something far beyond what anyone had expected. He adjusted the microphone, his voice steady, but filled with a warmth that reached everyone. Before we wrap up tonight, I just want to say one more thing, he began. What happened here tonight wasn't about me. It wasn't about a title I used to hold or the questions I've answered before. It was about something much bigger. It was about connection. It was about love. And it was about the courage to ask the kinds of questions that don't always have easy answers. The audience listened intently, many still visibly emotional. A few held hands with loved ones, while others wiped their eyes discreetly. In a world that feels so divided, he continued, it's moments like these that remind us of what truly matters, not what separates us, but what brings us together. And that's love. The love we show in small, quiet ways, every day. That's what God means to me. And I hope, in some way tonight, helped you see what it might mean to you. The applause came slowly at first, as though the audience was still processing the gravity of his words. Then it grew, filling the room with a thunderous wave of appreciation. People stood, clapping not just for him, but for the night itself, for the boy who had asked the question, for the stories that had been shared, and for the sense of unity that had enveloped them all. The boy and his mother began to make their way toward the exit, but they didn't go unnoticed. The president stepped down from the stage and walked toward them, weaving through the crowd with quiet determination. When he reached them, he crouched once again to meet the boy's gaze. "You have a gift," he said gently, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not everyone has the courage to ask the big questions. Don't ever lose that, okay?" The boy looked at him with wide eyes, his small face glowing with a mix of pride and gratitude. "I won't," he said softly. The president smiled, then turned to the boy's mother. "You're raising a remarkable young man," he said. "Thank you for sharing him with us tonight." The mother's voice cracked as she replied, "Thank you for giving him an answer he'll never forget." As the boy and his mother exited the hall, they weren't the only ones changed. The audience remained, many still deep in conversation. Strangers who had walked in, with little more than polite nods, were now exchanging stories, handshakes, even hugs. One man approached the stage after most of the crowd had dispersed. He was in his late 50s, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Mr. President," he said, "I didn't believe in much when I walked in here tonight. But after hearing what you said, maybe it's time I start looking for God. Not in the way I thought I should, but in the love I've been lucky enough to have in my life. Thank you for that." The president shook his hand firmly, his voice low but sincere. "Thank you for being here tonight. It takes strength to reflect like that." The man nodded, his lips pressing into a thin smile, before he walked out into the cool evening air, visibly lighter than when he'd entered. The president stood on the now empty stage for a moment longer, taking it all in. The room, once filled with chatter and anticipation, was now quiet. A peaceful kind of quiet where the echoes of the night's emotions still lingered. As he gathered his notes and stepped off the stage for the last time that evening, he glanced back at the room, his expression contemplative. He knew that the boy's question hadn't just left an impact on the audience, it had left an impact on him. Experiences like this highlight that life's true value lies not in the answers we possess, but in the courage to ask meaningful questions. They serve as a reminder that faith, love, and connection are not just abstract concepts. They are the vital threads that weave us together in our shared humanity. It's our responsibility to continue asking, to continue loving, and to consistently support one another. We live in a world that often feels fractured. Political divides, social unrest, and the constant barrage of information can leave us feeling isolated and disconnected. We're bombarded with answers, opinions, and arguments. But sometimes, what we truly need is the space to ask a simple question. The story of the young boy and the former president in Lexington, Kentucky, reminds us of the profound power of genuine inquiry. A single question, "What does God mean to you?" unlocked a wellspring of shared humanity, vulnerability, and connection. It wasn't a question about policy or politics. It was a question about the very core of human experience: meaning, belief, and love. The boy's bravery in asking that question, and the president's willingness to answer with honesty and vulnerability, created a ripple effect. It opened a space for others to share their own stories, their own struggles, and their own search for meaning. It demonstrated that even in the most ordinary of settings, a simple community hall, extraordinary connections can be forged. The key takeaway isn't about finding the right answer to the question of God. It's about the act of asking, the willingness to be vulnerable, and the power of listening with an open heart. It's about recognizing that we are all, in our own ways, searching for connection, for meaning, for something to hold on to in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain. How can we cultivate this kind of connection in our own lives? Embrace curiosity. Don't be afraid to ask the big questions, the ones that go beyond surface-level conversation. Ask people about their passions, their struggles, their beliefs, not to judge, but to understand. Listen actively. True connection requires listening with more than just our ears. Listen with your heart, with empathy, and with a genuine desire to understand the other person's perspective. Share vulnerably. Connection is a two-way street. Be willing to share your own stories, your own vulnerabilities, your own questions. This creates a space for others to feel safe doing the same, the common ground. Even in the midst of disagreement, there is almost always common ground to be found. Focus on shared values, shared experiences, and the shared human desire for connection and belonging. Embrace the silence. Sometimes, the most powerful moments of connection happen in silence, the shared understanding that words can't always express. The story of the boy and the president is a powerful reminder that connection isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the questions, to listen with an open heart, and to share our own journeys with vulnerability and courage. What are the big questions you've been pondering lately? What experiences have shown you the power of human connection? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this message resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel for more stories and reflections on the things that truly matter.